Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us at today's webinar, which is titled Embracing the Circular Economy and Net Zero in Your Organization. I am Seth van Doord. I'm BSI's Director for Sustainability and Energy, and it's fantastic to see so many of you here today. We're excited about the insightful discussions we have in store. We have an outstanding panel of experts who will guide us through these interconnected topics today. So this is an event which we've designed for our BSI members. The purpose really is to bring together our member community to inform you about the work that we do in sustainability and standards, and hopefully to inspire and support you on your sustainability journey. So today we're here to explore a couple of key vital concepts, both net zero and the circular economy. Both are crucial to shaping a more sustainable future, and they are more interconnected than ever before. As we face the challenges of climate change, it's becoming clear that these two approaches are not just complementary, but actually are supportive of one another. Net zero focuses on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible, while the circular economy is all about transforming how we produce, consume, and manage resources to minimize waste and our environmental impact. Together, they create a powerful pathway for businesses to innovate, reduce costs, and help create a more sustainable world. By integrating net zero goals with circular economy principles, businesses can now not only reduce emissions, but they can also create value from what would otherwise be wasted. So this synergy really enables companies to redesign products, extend life cycles, and find new efficiencies, which can significantly lower operational costs. Moreover, these combined efforts also foster resilience by reducing the dependencies on raw materials and mitigating risks associated with resource scarcity and fluctuating supply chains. Adopting both net zero and circular economy strategies can also support brand reputation, particularly as consumers are increasingly drawn to organizations that can really demonstrate a commitment to sustainability. It opens up new opportunities for innovation, whether in developing circular products, offering new services, or tapping into growing green and sustainable markets. And businesses that embrace these strategies are better positioned to meet regulatory requirements, attract investment, and build future-proof business models that benefits both the planet but also the bottom line. But it is a change from how we normally conduct our business. And that's why in this session, we're going to talk how we're going to practically support businesses of all sizes to reach net zero. We also talk about how businesses can shift to circular economy principles and transition to a more sustainable business models that minimize waste and maximize resource efficiency. We're also going to talk about why businesses are increasingly shifting their focus from simply aiming for net zero to adopting a more broader sustainability framework that encompasses circular economy principles. So we hope that today's sessions will provide you with more information, resources, and a clearer understanding of how and where to start, or to further advance your journey towards both net zero and circular economy principles. And hopefully we can create some tangible, valuable value along the way. So in order to do this, we've brought together a panel of experts. So we've got Chloe Fiddy, who's the Policy and Engagement Lead at IEMA, and she's going to talk about how net zero works in practice. We've got Agnes Krush, Policy and Engagement Lead at IEMA, who's going to talk about the principles of circular economy. And we're going to welcome Martin Charter later on, who's the Founding Director for the Centre of Sustainable Design at the University of the Creative Arts. And he's going to give an overview of circularity standards. So the session today will take about an hour and a half. We'll start with a presentation from our panelists, and after this we'll move to a quick Q&A. You can submit some questions here, and then we're going to conclude by around 11:30. Before I hand over to our panelists, I will set a little bit of context. So wondering if we can go to the welcoming slide, please. Yes, maybe go back 2 slides actually, because I probably need to read out the yes. So just to make you aware, just do a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. As mentioned before, we're going to have a Q&A session. You can submit your questions to us, and we will see those, and we can put some of those questions to the panel. Maybe we can answer some of those afterwards. You can simply click on the Q&A button inside panel and post your questions. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issues via the Q&A function, and hopefully our team will be able to help you out. Upon completion of a survey, we will also send you a recording of the webinar, and this is a CPD recognized webinar. So if you want a certificate, you can request this via the feedback survey following the webinar, which will be sent out to you. Next couple of slides, please. Yep. So allow me to set a little bit of context. I won't take too long, and hopefully as members you are aware, but for those that aren't, we are BSI, and we are the UK's national standards body. In most countries, there is one standards body per country. And as standards body, we are, particularly in the UK, we are independent from government and independent from industry. We are a profit for purpose organisation, and what that means is that we do generate a profit, but those profits don't get paid out to external shareholders. That profit goes back into the company to really put that money to work to support UK government and UK industry with standardisation needs. And we operate in the national interest, and we have an MOU with government. When we create standards as a national standards body, there is a due diligence process that is developed from consensus and consultation. And that's how our standards get their legitimacy and their reputation. Standards always start as voluntary guidance to capture best practice, but they can be referenced by regulation. And standards really build trust and provide assurance. And you know, there is a bit of an interloop there, because that consensus and consultation provides that legitimacy because it is built by the experts, and that builds that trust. And a lot of the work that I do is really to position our standards to support government policies in the more sort of areas like net zero and sustainability, and really support those drivers. Next slide, please. So as a national standards body, we are part of the international standards organisations that you can see here. So we represent the UK interest at the standards bodies at ISO, at the European level, CEN and CENELEC, the IEC, ITU and ETSI, and we represent the UK and UK interest. And we have a number of technical committees and mirror technical committees that support the standardisation activity within those international organisations. Next slide, please. Now, briefly to explain to you that there is a hierarchy in standards. Standards get their legitimacy through consensus. And there is a sort of hierarchy in standards here. In order to go through that standards process, if we look at the top, we've got international standards, ISO and IEC. And they are global standards. They are globally recognized, but obviously in order to reach consensus, that takes a long time. ISO is in 170 countries. So if you start with an ISO standard, it takes a long time to build those ISO standards. So below that, we've got regional standards, which are very much European standards with CEN and CENELEC. And then below that, we've got national standards. So when we create a British standard. And at the bottom there, we've got a sponsored standard or a publicly available specification. We also call them fast track standards. They normally take around 12 months to create. And a lot of the time what we end up doing when we talk about sort of supporting policy drivers is we create fast track standards programs in key areas for sustainability to really create that standard. And you might be familiar with PAS 2060 for carbon neutrality or PAS 2030 for retrofit. They often support policy drivers. We can create those in 12 months, but very often we can internationalize those standards as well and use them as seed documents into ISO. And there's a successful track record that we've got there. So this is our sort of arsenal of standards creation, if you like. And it allows us to really be agile and responsive and really operate at every different level in standards creation. Next slide, please. So often there might be a little bit of confusion. What is a standard? And people have a preconceived idea about a standard. We often divide the standards into this sort of 4 different areas. You have a sort of technical or specification which sets out the detailed requirements to be satisfied, often by a product or material or process. And it conveys objectively verifiable criteria to be fulfilled. Now, you also have a code of practice, which often gives recommendations for accepted good practice. You also have guides. A lot of the time, industries might need guides. So we bring industry together, and the experts will provide that guide. And those guides provide a broad and general information about the subject. And then there is a test method, which is a detailed procedure for performing an activity. And it really is a method of specifying or classification. So those are broadly the categories of standards, and sometimes people have one view of a standard, but as we can see, a standard here could be a number of things. Next slide, please. Now, the value of standards are, as we've mentioned before, global recognition, internationally recognized and applicable across a wide variety of jurisdictions. I think it's 170 now, actually, in ISO in particular. And so if you, as an example, worked at ISO 9001, that is accepted, in all of those countries that align to ISO. Standards, as I mentioned before, get the legitimacy through a consensus-based process. And I think our Director General often said, we bring to teas and coffees and we bring everyone together to agree that, and we distill that wisdom. So we're not the experts, but we bring all of the experts together to create those standards and reach consensus in often very difficult to reach consensus areas. Standards obviously help assurance and provides independent, transparent and trusted assurance and verification, both nationally and on an international scale. And they have real economy adoption, particularly as we talked about sort of the global recognition. And with that global recognition, that they facilitate international trade. So that's the sort of benefit of standards. We do a lot of work in the space of net zero and circularity. We have a lot of technical committees, and I know that look at this, and I know Martin will talk more about that. Next slide, please. In particular, there's the work that we've done on Flex 3030, which I think Chloe will be talking about. We'll dive deep into that, but also on circularity. And I think in particular, the one that sort of jumped out is BS 8001, which was produced way back in 2017, together with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So there's a lot of work that we do in this space, and we're keen to sort of dive a little bit deeper into that. So let me hand over to and welcome some of our first speakers. Next slide, please. So I would like to welcome Chloe Fiddy. Chloe is the Policy and Engagement Lead at IEMA. She is dedicated to empowering climate sector professionals to achieve optimal outcomes in their work. She has a strong commitment to enhancing environmental and social governance, and she believes that finding generally improved practices is essential for elevating living standards while reducing our ecological footprint. Also, Chloe is on our BSI advisory group for Flex 3030, which I mentioned earlier, and she provides a focus on practical solution and effective policy frameworks. Chloe, can I, you've got your camera on already, can I hand over to you here?
Yep. Thank you very much. That was a very warm introduction, so I don't need to reintroduce myself. Before we get going, I think there's a poll that we're going to put up to for our audience to give us their views on. I think the team is going to put this up. Here we go. Great. Okay, so what is driving your organisation to net zero? And we've got 5 options and the opportunity to put something in the Q&A. Client, customer pressure, regulation. Interesting. Fantastic. That's very interesting. That really does mirror actually things that we've noticed here at IEMA. When we're ready, we could perhaps move on to my first slide, and we can talk about that when people have finished voting. And the next one. Great, super. Okay, so that was a really interesting poll because we at IEMA, which is the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, we put out some guidance last year for SMEs on net zero transition planning and progress towards net zero. So for those of you who don't know, IEMA is a membership body for people who work in the sustainability sector. We have several hundred corporate partners from large organisations, government departments, multinational organisations, all the way through to lots of SMEs as well. And we have over 22,000 individual members. And so what we do is we work together with our members to put out practice guidance, of gathering together best practice and help our members do their jobs better. And we also speak collectively as the voice of our members to government for policy advocacy. And also when we participate in BSI projects, we're doing that with the knowledge that we've gained by speaking to our members. So it's sort of a very sort of democratic process. So last year we were looking at what we could do that would be really helpful, and we identified a project helping SMEs to do transition plans, put them together. And we started by interviewing a number of companies that were SMEs within the UK. We actually picked the healthcare sector, and the reason we picked the healthcare sector was that that sector is quite challenged, because what comes first for healthcare providers is health and safety. So for instance, it's quite difficult to reduce energy of your scope 3 emissions when everything has to be single use, packaged for cleanliness and so on. So we thought that if we surveyed those companies particularly, we would come up with the hardest problems, and therefore we thought that that would help solve everyone's problems. And we asked people what their biggest challenges were in starting on a transition plan, starting to get their net zero plans together. And more or less everything came down to these 5 questions. And they were really sort of around, understanding their reporting requirements. What do we have to do? A lot of companies told us, and this is what was reflected just now in the poll, is that their suppliers, their customers were asking them for the data. So they might not have to under any kind of legislation have to produce a transition plan or have to produce any kind of a plan for carbon reporting, but their customers were asking them. If you're in the supply chain of a larger organization that does, then you're their scope 3, and so you have to do it. So that was something that was a real challenge, understanding their reporting requirements. The second challenge that came up time and time again was engaging senior management and securing resources. So what we know is that obviously lots of SMEs don't have the scale to have people who are dedicated to do work in sustainability. Often we found that it is something as simple as the person who cycles to work or the person who nags them about colleagues about recycling kind of gets given, oh, and you can do sustainability on top of your job as well. And then that person isn't necessarily in the right place to get senior management actually on board with doing the things that need to be done. So that was a real problem that came up. We then found that another thing that people didn't really know how to do was setting the right target. So we know that we've got net zero. We know that we all know the sort of 2050 number, but actually what do your interim milestones look like? How do we get there? What pace should we get through get to the different milestones? Is it sort of, do you take your carbon footprint and divide it over the number of years, or do you try a bit harder at the beginning? And so that was really complicated. So we put together the guidance to help answer that question. The fourth thing that really came up a lot, particularly for SMEs, was engaging with supply chains. So as an SME, understandably, you probably don't have the clout that a larger company would have when it comes to purchasing. So if you're a massive company and you are a significant proportion of a client, as a client base to another company, you've probably got a bit of clout. You can enforce ways of manufacturing to get the carbon footprint down of the products that you're buying in. But if you're an SME, you're probably buying in smaller quantities, and you might not be the biggest customer of your supplier, so you're going to have a bit more difficulty with that. So engaging with the supply chains was something that came up quite often. And then finally, it was questions around what does a good practice report look like? How do we report it in a way that sort of reflects what we've done, where we're going, and in a way that is useful? And then the other question that came up quite a lot was verification and validation. So SMEs really wanted to know whether they need to get their reports externally verified by a consultant to sort of do that audit process. So we were able to reassure SMEs that actually, in most occasions, you don't need to do the verification process unless, of course, it's mandatory for some legal purpose, but that possibly tips you into not being an SME. But we do know that some SMEs do that as a voluntary basis rather. And we have actually just published, or about to publish, I think next week. No, we have just published guidance on verification and validation. So the guidance that we published actually answers all of those questions, but also it was really good because it enabled us to be very well informed when it came to developing the BSI Flex 3030, which also covers these topics. So we were able to bring all of that knowledge into it. If you could move on to the next slide, please. This is just a little reminder slide about the IEMA greenhouse gas management hierarchy, which is very well cited in many publications. The first thing that you need to do as an organisation is think about eliminating your emissions wherever possible. So is there something that you can just not do? Then the next thing to look at is reducing your emissions. So when you've eliminated everything that you can eliminate, what can you do? What can you use less of while still using it, but less of it? Substitution is about swapping things out. So if we could, could we substitute a fossil fuel van for an electric van, for instance, and then finally compensate. And compensate's really the last resort. When you're offsetting against your emissions, your residual emissions, you should only really be doing that if you've taken all three steps genuinely to the best of your abilities, first of all. So that's fairly well known. You can always find that. I think that image is pretty much well available online. So I just sort of remind people of that one. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so there is support available for organisations, SMEs who want to get going. So we've got the BSI Flex that I'm going to cover in the next slide. I've put in some QR codes. I hope they work. I'm really sorry if they don't. You'll have to Google it. But the Net Zero Standards Hub is a very good website. You've got opportunities to collaborate and find out what best practice is. So that's, oh, I've got a little note. So that's the a point that you can look at. And then I've added a QR code for transition planning for SMEs. If anyone is an IEMA member, then you will have access to that. So that might be quite helpful. So if we could move on to the next slide, we could talk about this. Okay, so the BSI Flex 3030 is a publication which is going to be super helpful for SMEs. It covers all the stages for looking at your transition planning. Now, I know that, we've got, so for instance, the topics here, we've got the management commitment, and it's got examples about how to get your senior managers engaged, something that we found that was a challenge. Selection of scope and boundaries is really useful because it helps you work out actually where to draw the line, and it really does give very full step-by-step guideline to that. Same thing for quantifying your emissions and baseline. And then again, targeting and planning reductions. Now, this is quite difficult for organisations because one of the questions that comes up quite often is, if I'm a growing organisation, how can I reduce my emissions? And that is a challenge for all organisations. Most companies want to grow. Hardly any companies say we've got enough business, thank you very much, we'll stay the same. And so there are options around looking at intensity metrics. So for instance, you might say our emissions are going to grow, but our emissions per unit of output are actually going to decrease. So that's one way of looking at it. It's of sort of justifying the increase in emissions, but actually by reducing the unit output of emissions. And then the other way of looking at it, I think that's quite interesting, is to consider what your organisation is doing to reduce emissions relative to other organisations. So here I'm not talking about emissions, avoided emissions, which is where you say, well, we sold X number of electric cars, so we took off X number of petrol cars off the road. So therefore, we've avoided emissions that way. I'm not really talking about that, but I'm sort of thinking if your organisation is a green product or service, then you might be helping to remove what we might call a grey product or service out of the market. And so that could be sort of overall in the overall context. You can't count that in your measurements, but it could be an important part of your transition plan when you come to sort of writing up your actual plan and why you're doing what you're doing. So then the plan also provides guidance on implementing reductions, measuring impact, and then how to review your plan. Financing is really well covered. Different options for finance are really covered there, which is, I think, will be helpful for people. And then reporting and communication, so how to do it. And then something that I haven't put on this slide, but which is really good, is the Flex has case studies. So you can actually see a worked example of how an organisation, it's a fictional organisation, but how an organisation might go about doing the right thing. And so I highly commend the BSI Flex 3030 for the audience of this webinar. That was my final slide. I think the next one just has Q&A, but I know that we're doing Q&A at the end, so I will pass on to the next speaker.
All right, thank you so much there, Chloe. That was really interesting. There was a few things that jumped out at me. Really interesting that you sort of picked out the idea of particularly for SMEs, to get senior management support, and but also recognizing that there's a lack of resources and how to do it. So hopefully our standards can do something there. The other thing that I thought was interesting when you talked about Flex 3030, that you talked about that there is a recognition that a business needs to grow and how that ties in with emission reduction. So there's quite a lot for us to discuss there. I now would like to invite our next speaker. Hello, Agnes. Great to see you. So Agnes Cruz is the Policy and Engagement Lead at IEMA. She focuses on practical solutions and effective policy frameworks. She's committed to helping organisations transition towards a more sustainable models that minimise waste and maximise resource efficiency. She will share valuable insights and strategies to enhance the understanding of circular economy and its impact on future sustainable efforts. I think your presentation today will talk more about the principles of circularity and the circular economy. Are you all right for me to hand over to you there, Agnes?
Yes, thanks, Seb. Thank you and welcome everybody. It was nice to be here to talk to you about the concepts behind circular economy. I think we have a poll before we start my section, and the question that we have for you guys is, what incentives would encourage your organization to adopt circular economy principles? And it's really always interesting to look at the answers to these types of questions. Why are people doing, what is the why? And obviously the financial incentives, the customer demands, regulatory requirements, and that competitive advantage come up very often in different proportions. So it's going to be really interesting how this it weighs up for our audience today. And I can see it's kind of, almost evenly split. The financial incentives are actually not scoring as highly, which I think is quite interesting, with that competitive advantage being the main answer that most people favour, almost 40%, which is really interesting because we will be talking about the business models, the ways of operating, the kind of future thinking about how can we do business in that more circular way. Just give you guys another couple of minutes to respond to that. Obviously, the regulatory requirements, there's plenty already, but they are mostly around managing waste, so managing that kind of downstream end of life materials, but the government is looking more actively at circular economy, and they are going to be releasing a circular economy strategy next year, I believe, which is really exciting to people in the sector. So we will see, and obviously in the EU, there's more things happening at the moment. Interesting. So if we could have I've got control now, fantastic. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is the main principles. You know, what does it mean? What is circular economy, and what is it, and what do we actually need to do to incorporate it into how we operate, how we run businesses, how we create value and bring revenue, essentially. But first, just a definition. I'm sure many of you have seen some of these pictures, illustrations. The big one on the right is something you might recognize from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, something called the butterfly chart, and it illustrates the biological and the technical cycles. We have an illustration that I quite like, where the circular economy eliminates the need for the bin. But when you look at it, you might be a little bit confused. What do I actually need to do as a business, as an individual? And at IEMA, what we wanted to do is just kind of simplify it and put more into action. And so the definition for us is that the circular economy is a tool that helps to keep products and materials in circulation. That's the circular part of that concept. And the second part, the economy, is about maintaining the value of these items and these materials. You know, the value of a mobile phone is in its function as a mobile phone. The moment it loses that function, it loses its value. And even though you might be able to reuse the components or recycle the materials, the highest value is in that function. So it's all about retaining that. And I think what we want to remember, it's not just about that downstream side of things. We are moving into thinking about this more holistically. It's not just about recycling. It's not just about single products and single materials like packaging. It's much more about how do we operate the economy to be able to make the use of materials more effective, essentially. And as part of our work with our circular economy steering group, we have developed these 6 goals for decision makers. So what do businesses, decision makers, designers, policymakers actually need to do to implement circular economy? So the first 4 are very much kind of action. So narrow. Can we use less? Can we not do something? This is very similar to what Chloe mentioned earlier. By not buying a piece of equipment or an item, not only are you then not using the materials to produce it, you then also don't need to deal with it at the end of its life. And so from the carbon impact, you're not using the carbon to produce and extract materials for production, manufacturing, transport, but you're also then not need to think about the emissions coming from managing end of life, whether that's through recycling, which obviously is the better option, but also disposal, landfill, incineration, etc. It's also about slowing the use of that material. So how can you use it for longer? Can you repair it? Can you maintain it? Can you make sure that the life of that item is well spent. And by having those kinds of warranties, guarantees, maintenance regimes, repair, you can extend the life of that item. It's also about intensifying the use of it. So we all know there are certain bits of kit that just sit there underused, collecting dust. How can we make sure that they are fulfilling their function more fully? Can it be shared out? Can it be potentially loaned out? Can you work in partnership to actually procure those types of items together to maximize the use of that item? And then it's about cycling, and that's both in that kind of higher value, the item as its function. So for example, furniture, if we can kind of use it as a piece of furniture going around another organization, whether that's through resale or donation, and then you're thinking about, okay, well, how can I use the materials and recycle the materials? Obviously, some of them lend themselves better than others to that. And then the last two goals, the regenerate goal is about thinking, well, how can I use materials that are essentially better? So can we avoid using toxic and hazardous materials and processes in the production? And then also, then at the end of the life, we then potentially don't need to deal with hazardous waste, and thinking about whether that particular item can be made out of things that can go back into the biological cycle. So for example, fibers, and for example, textiles, not mixing artificial plastic type fibers with cotton that can decompose at the end of its life. And then lastly, this almost attitude and behavior about sharing, about making sure that this transition to circular economy is fair and just and inclusive of other people. How can we make that transition more useful for people that work in supply chains close to home or further afield? So how does circular economy support decarbonisation? I always think about circular economy as a tool to help us decarbonise. And, you know, the decarbonisation also is not the end goal, right? It's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions to then reduce our impact on the planet to be able to essentially survive. And the use of materials has a huge greenhouse gas impact. 54% of all of these emissions are due to material use. If you work on your company's carbon analysis, you look at potentially scope 1, 2 and scope 3, which is associated with your supply chains, and you will see often that this is a huge portion of a business's impact. So by reducing the material impact, by reducing what you are procuring and choosing better products, you will have a huge impact on this. And the other thing to consider is that by sourcing materials from recycled, remanufactured sources, we are being more resilient. A lot of materials that we will need to decarbonize, you know, things like lithium for batteries and wind turbines and rare earth minerals, they come from areas where there might be political instability, the supply chains might be fragmented, there's a lot of competition, and there will be a lot of competition on global markets for these particular materials because they are so critical to decarbonisation, but also to lots of other technologies. We need to make sure that we can get hold of them, and by circulating them and by keeping them closer to home, we can weather those instabilities. And I think we also need to consider that Circular economy often is a bit of a gateway, it's a bit of a hook for people to get involved in sustainability. As Chloe mentioned, that that one person in the company that for whatever reason is wanting to improve recycling learns more about sustainability and becomes a champion sustainability manager and a driving force for that company to decarbonize. And there's a lot of transferable skills within the circular economy business models that then can be used to decarbonize our economy. And so what I wanted to show today is some examples of how circular economy works in practice. And before I kind of dive into those, I just wanted to highlight that obviously in business there are different business models, and those circular business models have different revenue mechanisms. And linking back to that slide, the previous slide about how do you intensify a use of an item, you can set up your business model to support that, and there's something called product as service, which you can access the function of that product without actually buying that product. And it can be a different system. It can be a contract, it can be a lease, it might be a pay as you go, it might be a partnership, it might be a shared service with somebody else. So there are different ways of thinking about what always has been kind of like, well, we're going to buy something and then it's going to be ours, and then we're going to use it as we please. There's different way of thinking about it, and many of these business models will also put some strain on the manufacturer to think about how that product is designed to then be efficiently used, then be used for longer, to have durability, to be repairable, to then be potentially dismantled for the parts to be used in other places. So the first example I think might surprise you. I was thinking about examples, and obviously my first thoughts were about those kind of classic things like reusable coffee cups and eBay and vintage. But actually, when it comes to it, there's an example that we all know and nobody thinks about it as a circular business model. It's cars. We all use cars. We know that we need them to get around, but actually there are so many kind of circular ways that we use cars and vehicles. 20 to 30% of vehicles these days are leased. When you buy a new vehicle, you're not going to scrap it just because it's broken. You have maintenance and you have repairs available. You resell cars again and again and again. There's a testing regime and there's standards around how these cars are roadworthy and have to be assessed every year with the MOT testing. So there's a lot here when you think about those circular business models where this has already been in operation for many years, and then that is even before we think about the advances in how cars have been manufactured over the last years, the lean manufacture concepts, the automation, the robotics that all help design cars more effectively, use less materials to produce them. And there's a brilliant example from Renault. They have set up a factory specifically targeting those kinds of circular activities. They even remanufacture cars that were completely written off, so they wouldn't be kind of roadworthy through a normal repair shop, but they can reassess those materials. They also do electric battery reconditioning. So it's a very interesting model of how they're embracing the principles and how they're applying that to their business. The next example, again, very familiar to many of you, I'm sure, office furniture. a Dutch company. I'm going to now butcher the pronunciation, I'm sure. Ahrend. They have been thinking about this for many, many years. They design furniture to be reused and to be repaired. They think about how, when the item is being worn, how can we make sure that it can be reupholstered, the wheels can be replaced, how can it be repaired. They also provide a lot of services around reimagining offices, and even provide services such as furniture hire. So, for example, if you're kind of in between, and if you're a growing business, you might know that you know in 2 years' time you're going to have to move offices again. You might want to lease the furniture, use them as a service to then be able to renew while you are going to be moving to another location. And closer to home, an organisation called Crown Workspaces, they provide a very holistic approach. They will do removals, but they will also think about how can we help an organisation refurbish the furniture that they have and use them in the best possible way. They resell furniture as well, so you can go there and access secondhand items, and they also help with donations. So any items that are surplus to requirements can be donated into charity, and they also help with recycling. And then lastly, an example in construction. Construction has a huge carbon footprint. Again, Ellen MacArthur cited that if we use those circular economy principles, we can reduce the emissions from building materials by 38%. And it's all about, again, this is very familiar. We have been doing retrofit of buildings for many, many years. And this is Pall Mall in Manchester. And they have done some analysis on what the carbon impact would be of a brand new build. And even if it is a low carbon build, it will still be producing more carbon long term than a retrofitted office building. And there's lots of more example on the Green Building Council website on about these projects where a structure and foundation have been reused. And again, concrete and steel are hugely carbon intensive. So by reusing those structures, we can really make a huge dent in those carbon emissions. So I think that's all my slides. At AIMA, we have developed a number of documents to support businesses, circular economy 101, which because I know it can be quite a big thing to get your head around. We try to simplify it and make sure that an organisation can then speak to their shareholders and the management and explain what they actually want to achieve, and the kind of strategies that you can implement in your business to move you into those kind of circular business models, and how you can apply that in how you work. So I think that's all from me. Seb, I will then pass over to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much, Agnes. I hope everyone can hear me okay, because they've decided to do some building works next door. That was really interesting, Agnes. Thank you very much. I think for me, there's quite a few things, a few elements that jumped out. The values in the function, I thought was one of those things I hadn't really thought about as much or as deeply, but that's such a sort of good point. The other point that jumped out for me was recycling and resilience. I think we sometimes forget that it helps with us reaching resilience. Sorry, the business models for me were very interesting as well. I think a lot of businesses want to move to subscription business models. I work with a number of SMEs that always looked at how can we create a subscription model. And actually, I personally hadn't sort of appreciated that circularity and subscription models could work together. So yeah, very interesting. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more. I can see that Martin has turned his camera on. Martin, thank you very much for joining us. I'll briefly introduce you. Professor Martin Charger is the founding director of the Centre for Sustainable Design at the University for the Creative Arts, and he's a member of the senior management team at UCA's Business School for the Creative Industries. He has over 30 years of experience in business sustainability, including sustainable innovation, product sustainability, and the circular economy. He has authored numerous publications such as Sustainable Solutions and Design for the Circular Economy. Martin has played a significant role in international and national standardization efforts in eco-design and the circular economy, and he currently chairs BSI's Circular Economies Committee. He is also the founder of the Sustainable Innovation Conference Series and the charity Farnham Repair Cafe, which he received the King's Award for voluntary service in 2024. Martin, I think you're going to give an overview of circularity standards. Can I hand over to you there?
Thanks very much for that overly positive introduction, Seb. With just on the last one, I didn't receive the award. Our volunteers at the Repair Cafe received the award, so thanks very much. So I think as Seb said, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some sort of policy developments and standards developments related to circularity. So I think we have a poll that should be popping up very soon. So this is related to whether people have considered standardization in relation to circularity, and I'm expecting this to be a new topic, and therefore the poll so far seems to be highlighting that, with only a small proportion having really followed this. So interesting that not sure is there, which says there are other parts of the organization perhaps engaging with these issues. So that's an interesting one to me as well. So showing again it's a new topic. So it looks like perhaps it's sort of stopped at that point, or maybe there's one or two other things coming on. But when's the team's ready to sort of move on to the presentation, I'm happy to start clicking away. So again, we're seeing here, perhaps circularity and standards is a new issue, some level of uncertainty, etc., etc. So I think the next challenge is to just click the button and then wait and then click again. Yes, indeed. Great. Thanks very much, team, for that. So as I mentioned, I've had a fair amount of time looking at sustainability in products and innovation, and engaged in a lot of practical activities, as well as completing publications like this book here. Whoops. Aha. Right. How can you take me back one, guys? Is that possible? No, you can't. Okay, so circular economy is a growing emerging issue, and there are now something right. What we've seen. Thank you very much. Clicking too fast there. I thought this is quite a useful. Right, I understand. So I think this is quite a useful slide, in that this is from Google Trends, and it tracks the use of terminology, and anybody can use it for any topic, and this really just shows how the use of the term has significantly increased over the last sort of 10 years or so. In fact, the first circular economy law was actually published in China in 2018, but really Europe started to sort of pick up on the topics particularly, and Europe is the driver in a global context on this, from the sort of early 2010s. So what we also see here, again, trying to get the sensitivity on the slides, is now there is over 70, 80 countries that have strategies passed or planned strategies passed or in development around circular economy. And until very recently, England, as part of UK, was not one of those. I think Agnes has well described, circular economy aspects. This is, a common model that built on something that was developed by the McDonough Browngart, team back in the sort of 2000s. But essentially, it's about sort of thinking about products crudely from natural materials, wood, fibers, and products from technical materials, and how we, essentially reframe the discussion around waste to thinking more about how we retain value in products, materials, and components. So it's how do we keep that value in economic and social systems? But part of the challenge of this system is it doesn't recognize the reality that many products includes mixed materials, technical materials and biological materials. So, for example, an example of socks that might include second life nylon, that might include cotton and elastomer. Effectively, you've got technical and biological materials, and those products will be in effect going designed for death, as somebody called it. So you then have to look at how you separate out those materials. So it's, in terms of design, it's still a new topic. And in our repair cafe, where we've had over 2,600 products coming through, we have seen very, very few of those products that are designed for ease of dismantleability and repairability. So the reality is these issues are not, generally speaking, being integrated in design and development. As I mentioned before, I think when the present government came into place, they did a big review of policy, and as part of that, they recognised there were plans in process through the Labour manifesto on net zero and carbon, but with circularity, there wasn't anything there. So effectively, what this present government have recently put into action over the last few months is a call to set up a task force for England. Scotland and Wales already have plans and strategies in place. And was mentioned earlier, a call has gone out for experts with, you bring in different stakeholders. And the goal is to, seemingly to pull the task force together quickly and over something like a 6-month time period, once assembled, for a strategy and plan to be developed. So it hasn't been an issue, as an overarching issue within the UK, but it is now. And going back up to the top, the Undersecretary has, as part of her responsibility now, circular economy. And there are also equivalent roles that have been set up in the Commission. And again, circularity is part of similar roles in the Commission now. The big overarching, shift in particularly in Europe came in 2015 with the publishing of the Circular Economy Action Plan, and that really has brought circularity into European policy. It introduced it, and really looking at how aspects of circularity can be brought into a wider set of sectors. It also kicked off the first set of standardization, particularly starting off looking at the energy-related product sector, that published a series of standards related to repair, remanufacturability that I'll come back to. So that was a sort of starting point of a strategic shift from the Commission. That was updated in 2020 and really reinforced, particularly this broadening of the agenda and scope of circularity within European regulations to look not just at the areas that it focused on previously, that being packaging, electronics and automotive, and particularly on recycling, to really looking at a broader set of sectors and to other aspects of circularity. And what we're seeing is targeted policy and regulations emerging, focus on design side, also on the sale and use phase. Of note, there is the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, the green claims legislation that is setting out more specific guidance on what you can or not say in terms of environmental claims and products. And in the use phase, the sort of focus for the future, perhaps a repair directive. At the moment, that's focused on a limited number of products, but again, it's setting the direction of travel. So probably the most significant piece of policy that the Commission it has now passed is the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation that effectively is significantly expanding the original scope of the Eco Design Directive. The Eco Design Directive was focused on energy-related products and really focused primarily on reducing energy consumption of products. But this strategic piece of regulation is going significantly further. So it's expanding the focus of its interests around into essentially over time all products, all sectors. It's bringing in a lot more, let's say, environmental and circularity requirements. Rather than just focusing on reducing energy consumption. So there's about 14 different criteria that are highlighted in the annex to the regulation that include now a whole series of circularity aspects. And it's also bringing in other areas that I'll mention quickly here. If I can move forward. Whoops. It's also talking about mandatory green public procurement, so that's much more focused on procurement end. This has been talked about for a long time. The details are slightly unclear of that, particularly for the clothing and textile sector. Right, it really is quite sensitive here. So I try and remember what was on that slide. So they're really talking about a shift away from, so the destruction, so there's a practice in the textiles and clothing sector over the destruction of clothing and textiles. And what they want to do is put that to bed, and regulations will be coming in. The other key element to that is this area called the digital product passport that the Commission are really reinforcing that they are going to take action on. They've started work on standardization around the IT infrastructure, but they haven't announced the content of this. So this effectively will be digital passports, literally, that accompany products throughout its life cycle. A key point of note is the indication. There's strong indications. I am not a lawyer, and I really put many provisos on this. This is just what I've picked up on my radar. There are strong indications that the textile and clothing sector, as well as steel and iron, are going to be the first sectors that the Commission start to look at in terms of regulations. So particularly for clothing, textiles and fashion, this is going to be a significant challenge because the sector has not really faced these sorts of regulations before. Other key aspect from a regulatory point of view is, as I mentioned, this repair directive that was passed earlier in the year that really is looking to stimulate repair and shift away from replacement, fast consumption, if you like. There are broadly two elements to this: is requirements for manufacturers to provide repair services, within certain provisos, within the legal guarantee, within two years guarantee, but also significantly more requirements, or in effect that are going to be placed on the suppliers, but giving more power to the consumers. There's this idea, as many of you might have heard, the right to repair. So this is the empowerment of this to give effectively consumers a lot more power to request information on repairability, and for member states and others to provide a lot more information on repairers on a database, and those repairers have to provide information and forms. So really, there's this shift. This is primarily focused on, I believe, home appliances and a couple of other sectors, but I think this is showing the direction of travel. So now coming into the focus of standardization. So as was mentioned earlier, we had the BS 8001 published in 2017. I was part of that team. Elaine MacArthur Foundation were one of the people involved in this. They did not drive it. It was driven by a colleague from industry, with lawyers and other key practitioners involved in this. And effectively, this was the first, guidance standard on implementing circularity in organizations. And I think this is an area that I just, would reinforce. So within circular economy, in the context of organizations, what we're talking about is how we can increase circularity within our organizations and within our products, crudely. Sometimes they get confused around the role of organizations in circular economy or societies, but effectively what we're talking about in standards is, standards and guidance about how we can, build circularity into very practical actions at an organization and product level. So effectively, this was the first standard. There was opportunities to take this to become a base for an ISO standard. But effectively, that did not move forward. So what we saw is a proposal by the French to look at an ISO standard related to circularity and environmental management systems, and that was sort of thrown out by the 170, 180 countries. But then suddenly, in 3 to 6 months, a technical committee on circularity led by the French was set up. This, having been involved in this since 2018, this process has been very difficult and challenging. COVID is one of the challenges of this, but there has been a lot of challenges with the process. And one of those is that we learned, of course, within 170, 180 countries, there are very different perspectives on what circularity means. There's still a big belief within many countries and probably in many organizations that circularity is just another word for recycling. Recycling is one element of that, and then within certain definitions, it's actually considered to be outside of circularity. So there are big, issues in getting people on the same piece of paper. And what we saw, as earlier mentioned, there is now 4 standards that have been published after this sort of, let's say, quite challenging process. And those standards were published in May. The first 3 are the prime ones: terminology, business models, and measurement. Probably the most mature one of those is the measurement one. But effectively, my personal observations of this is that there was not enough industry engagement in this. So the practitioner information is not as strong as it could be. And I think this is now being recognized in that there is now a revision process that's starting on the first standards, with a view to kicking that process off again to improve it and perhaps increase industry engagement in these standards with a view to moving that process starting again in summer next year. The only other point I mentioned here is there is something called Product Circularity Data Sheet standard that will be published, and this is very important to keep an eye on in relation to digital product passports. So moving swiftly on, we also have European standardization now that's been set up a year ago, and indeed I just came out of the technical committee meetings yesterday, and there are a series of standards in development at various stages. What was unusually decided is normally ISO standards would become a European standard, an EN standard, but perhaps because of some of the challenges, there was agreement with the terminology standard, and the business model standard is for there to be a new process put in place that effectively aligned those standards more closely to European regulations. There is a standard in development around information sharing. It's called information sharing because we don't know what a digital product passport will look like until the Commission announces it. So there's some strategic work starting on a standard to start to think that through. And there is also a rather challenging standard emerging in early stages of discussion around extended producer responsibility that has emerged from Sweden brackets IKEA, and also a new proposal that has been put forward on remanufacturing. I mentioned 2015 and the materials efficiency standards, and these were a series of standards published back in 2019, 2020, mainly focused on the energy-related product sector, but this was guidance effectively on repair, remanufacturing, etc. But because of the Commission's shift, and this is an important point, in terms of its broadening of its focus on different product categories, this group in its subsequently is looking to revise its standardization for all products and all sectors, not just energy-related products. And indeed, an important standard that literally I believe has just been published yesterday or today is a new standard on circular design, guidance standard that again covers circular design, how you integrate circularity into design and development for all products, all sectors, so not just for the energy-related product sector. So moving pretty much to the end of the presentation now, and keeping to time, is that one area, particularly on that last standard, one of the things that we haven't perhaps seen, companies can do it, but it's the driver. What's going to drive this? Customers, legislation. So it's how you incorporate environmental considerations into product development and design. So we already have standardization on how to do that, both from a design and development point of view, but from how you embed it into ISO 14001 and 9000. So those standards already exist, and these are perhaps broader than circular design. So a little bit of a radar point here is, although there is this standard on circular design, if you are going to look at this area, I would suggest you also look at the eco-design standards, because that sets the wider framework that you might nest any activity related to circularity. I know I've gone through that very quickly. I suppose my key point there is, circularity is on the agenda now. We will see more policy and more regulations. UK government now picking this up will mean there is likely to be other new developments, perhaps that will fall in line with more closely with what is going on in Europe, because what we picked up from industry is this concern about being out of industry that's working in effect in Europe sees these developments, and they see UK Inc. out of line with this. So the key point is to start to find somebody in your organization to start to monitor this, even if it's half a day a week. But there is going to be more issues starting to emerge, more questions that you'll have to deal with more directly from customers or other stakeholders, or aspects that you'll have to start to think about bringing into your supply chains and having discussions with your suppliers. So thanks very much. I hope you got at least one point from that presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. I've got quite a few more than 1 point out of your presentations. Apologies for the technical issues. It does seem to be a rather sensitive platform. I think for me, it was very interesting to see the Google Trends, the sort of uptick. That's always a sort of very, very good indicator, because it's, in my opinion, it's pretty reliable of where consumer sentiment is. Making sustainable products the norm in the EU, it seems to be a very good sort of initiative. Interesting to see the first sectors to sort of face some sort of regulatory requirement for the fashion industry to be one of the first. That seems to me to be a very difficult sector to promote circularity, but it's probably also very necessary in light of sort of fast fashion and all of that. And yeah, I mean, as you say, it's probably key to find someone in the organisation to start monitoring this. Yeah, a lot of points there. I think we're moving now to the sort of Q&A session. So can I ask all panelists to turn their camera on while I'm going to sort of pose some questions to you? And Sarah, are you there as well? Are you joining? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Do you mind briefly introducing yourself, Sarah? I obviously know who you are, but it'd be good for the panelists to know.
Yes, of course. Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Walton. I work with Seb in the knowledge team at BSI, and I've worked closely with Chloe on the work on the net zero Flex for small, medium-sized enterprises on transition planning for net zero, and also with Martin quite closely looking at some research around textiles and fashion circularity as well. We're looking at the moment. So that's who I am.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. And yes, probably can pose a few questions to you. I think, as I mentioned, there were a few things sort of that jumped out to me. One of those were the opportunities, which I must admit, Agnes, in your presentation sort of jumped out to me, because actually I hadn't sort of appreciated some of those elements. I'm sort of starting a sort of conversation starter with you. What do you see as some of the biggest opportunities, but also challenges in both aligning net zero goals and circular economy principles? Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, starting with the opportunities, I think being an early adopter of these practices is potentially going to give businesses a big advantage. Again, don't want to be quoting examples that have issues elsewhere, but we don't have DVDs anymore because Netflix have jumped and blockbustered and want to carry on and be an adopter of this technology of streaming and the concept of not actually having a physical copy of a film or a TV series. And I think it's important for businesses to recognize this, that there is an opportunity. I think there's a big potential that if you don't adopt these practices, you are going to be left behind because of consumer practices, but also because the burden of regulation that Martin mentioned will be very difficult to operate in. And obviously, as it's a change, it will have challenges. Change is challenging, and it will mean adopting to new ways of thinking. It will mean changing how things are done, and in many cases it is quite difficult to do, but I think at the moment it feels like that is the direction of travel and it's not going to change, and you will just have to do that. But on the kind of practical challenges, concept is, being discouraged by the fact that you can't do things perfectly. I think it's a big thing for me. We're not talking about all businesses becoming circular businesses overnight. You want to look at what's achievable and how you can contribute and take it step by step and take it into that positive direction. Bit by bit, you will need to trial and error things to see how they are working and how they're being implemented, and you will need to change along the way. And I think that's basically how the world is now. You have to respond quickly. You have to adopt. You have to be flexible in your approach, and that's how things are going to need to go, really.
Really interesting. And having worked for different sized companies, including a few sort of fast growing startups, I think the early adopter opportunity is quite interesting. I think particularly because I always look at the policy and regulatory landscape. It just helps the way I used to set strategies in businesses, because I know things are going to change and I know there's a policy driver behind it. I think Martin sort of laid out that there are going to be some regulatory requirements as a policy driver now. There's also sort of consumer interest in this. So actually there is a significant opportunity to start to get familiar with this. I think the other thing for me is it's always a journey, right? So standards have a role to play in that, but it takes a while, as you sort of sketched out, to sort of get fully to grips with that. But I think that's okay. But it does provide a competitive advantage as well, I suppose. Did anyone else have any sort of thoughts on that? Don't worry if not. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, just a quickie from what you said there, Seb. So it's sort of recognizing probably on net zero and circularity where your maturity level are. Are you a starter? You're already down a line, you advanced. And I think one of the things that was very good in BS 8001 is that we did lay out this maturity matrix with guidance on guidance on where you are. Often and being involved in particularly all the eco design standards, one of the things that's often missed, particularly for SMEs, is guidance on where to start.
Yes.
And that's really important, and it goes back to a number of, I think, Chloe's, useful checklists there, getting senior management engaged, pitching to them, just getting it on the agenda, getting it literally as an agenda item in relevant meetings. So that is really a key point. Where do you start? How do you start? And I think we've got sort of people on the call that can help with starting that process.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. And one of the points that I'm sort of often sort of try and make, and I think we have a Net Zero City Advisory Group. We had the Committee for Climate Change on there as well, and I think they agreed that actually don't let good become the enemy of perfect, right? And starting is better than, and I think starting's better than not doing anything. But it can be so daunting that actually oftentimes with some of these things we get analysis paralysis and there's so much to do and then we do nothing. So even an imperfect first step is better than a perfect plan tomorrow, right? Probably related to that then, Martin, is what role do you feel standardization plays in then helping businesses implement circular economy strategies within their businesses?
I take that two ways. I think that there is opportunity, particularly with the existing standardization, it's providing guidance. I will put the health warning on the first ISO standards are a starting point. It's a line in the sand, so it isn't a panacea, but there is useful information. But I'd say the second point is to engage in standardization, particularly producers engage in standardization, bring your points across to the meetings, because that was one of the challenges. And this is really an absolute call as heading up the Circular Economy Committee across all of the circularity is a call to get more businesses involved, to provide the realities, particularly of the challenges of implementation. What are the challenges? How do you get it going in an organization? We've got sort of there's sort of plenty of experts out there that can give sort of conceptual views, but the real challenges that businesses face is how to do.
Yes, absolutely, and that provides sort of a significant opportunity, and that's sort of where we are. And I think it's an important point to make that a lot of our standardization reflects good practice as we capture it, and to the point of not making perfect the enemy of good. Sometimes with standardization, that's also the fact, right? So we distill the wisdom and expertise that we have at that time, BS 8001 in 2017. That does need to evolve, but sometimes some of those standards, industry moves quite quickly, and actually those standards will need to be revised, and they reflect good practice from a few years ago. Sarah, did you want to jump in there at all? Do you see what the role of standards and standardization is? Obviously, you've been leading a lot of the work that we do in this space with Flex 3030 and your previous work in circularity. Did you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, as Martin was saying there, what's actually probably really important right now, and we do hear from our stakeholders, where do we start, what do we do, and our response to that is to try to create things such as the Flex and the supporting Net Zero Standards Hub, which kind of give a lot of we hope clear advice as to step by step into how you do a thing, but what we actually we need sort of, it has to be a virtuous circle again. It has to be a feedback loop where we've got industry feeding their own practical solutions that they've found in their own organizations into the work that we are trying to create. So we can't do this in a vacuum. We really need the input of stakeholders who are practitioners, people who are actually in the field, who are working on it, and to the point about the revision. I mean, that's exactly why those international standards are already going back into a round of revision, because we need more practitioners engaged in it. And actually, perhaps because those are very generic, we're also trying to focus in a lot more on those areas where there are obviously those industries where there's obviously going to be need, such as the textiles and clothing sector. This is going to be, they're a massive sector. They have a huge impact on the planet. Like the food sector, it's like they're one of the essentials. It's kind of, we have to feed and clothe ourselves, and the impact of the production of that, and the potential waste there, well, not just potential, the actual waste that is currently coming out of that industry, means that we really need to work with that industry and hopefully to make them make a difference. And I would say that's what we hear. We're hearing a lot from that industry. How do we do this? Where do we go from here? We want to respond, obviously, with their help.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And I think there's a role for industry there. I mean, there's this sort of question as well, and I think we're starting to see that, governments and policymakers. What's the role, governments and policymakers? Chloe, keen to see if you've got sort of any view on that, but how do we feel governments and policymakers can better support businesses adopting both net zero and circular economy principles? I think we have some stability now, that maybe have to touch wood, but it does seem to be a sort of more stable policy outlook when it comes to net zero and that. But we're keen to see if you have any sort of recommendations for government and policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, I think stability is obviously the thing that comes up time and time again. We want stable policy. Organisations want that to know that they've got to make the investment. And I think also organisations that are already making those investments are really calling on it because they feel that will level up the playing field a little bit. I hope that the government sticks with stability on that policy, but the recent week, I think we've seen press on potential changes to the EV targets that car manufacturers are going to be having to meet, and looking at the sort of rowing back a little bit on boiler manufacturers not producing enough heat pumps. So I would say that the landscape hasn't entirely settled yet in terms of that policy. And I think even governments that sort of say, this is our policy, we're going to stick with it, events happen that can come along and sort of trip them up. Russia invades Ukraine, and suddenly your gas supplies, gone crazy. So I think sticking with the solid policies is really important. But also, I think as other measures as well, such as, finding ways to actively encourage green finance so that organisations can access the finance they need to do the projects they need to do. So I think encouraging the finance sector as well would be very helpful from government.
Yes, and I think there's an interesting part for me. It's a sort of pet peeve of mine that we often, particularly in politics, present either or choices, and particularly when we look at sort of importing our energy from different parts of the world. Um, there seems to be a bit of background noise there, but again, net zero, it's not either or. Energy security or net zero, to me, both go hand in hand. If we have more renewable energies, then and we can produce more of our own energy, then we're also less dependent on imports, right? And I think that the quicker we can hit that, the better it is. But very often it becomes a polarizing conversation of, well, we want energy security and not net zero, and to me the two are absolutely hand in hand. So I think that for me there's always something to do for policymakers on the sort of messaging there. I'm aware that we're going.
Sorry, the same for food security as well. Energy security, food security. Almost any industry you want to pick, you could have that conversation.
Yes, and it very often becomes a sort of either or, and actually the choice is and, right? That's where I think politicians can really sort of help industry. So I think we're running slightly over time, but I'm going to sort of make an executive decision to go on a little bit longer. I think I've been given a 5-minute warning, so just making people aware of that. But let me have a look at some live questions. I think there's a question here that says for SMEs and indeed companies, are we overcomplicating the approach as complication adds to the administrative cost, which in itself is very inefficient? Thoughts, please. So I think there's something there about, and it is, tricky for businesses to sort of get to grips with all of this. Having been there myself, having to try and implement some standards, it isn't easy. So do people have any sort of thoughts on that? Are we overcomplicating things? Feel free.
Okay.
I was going to just sort of jump in and say, a good starting point would be to look at your own energy efficiency. You might not be in the ESOS scheme, but maybe do an ESOS assessment anyway and see what your own emissions are like. And then something that's can be quite helpful is to make a sort of a corporate decision to assess any new project against your goals of achieving sort of energy efficiency. If you're quite a small organisation. And just that trigger point of having that checklist, whenever a company does a new thing, you'll probably look at sort of what's it going to do to the budget, what's it going to do to our forecast plans, what's it going to do for, some organisations will have to look at equalities and all that sort of thing. Having that extra checklist about what's it going to do to our energy consumption is a good start.
Yes, no, absolutely. Martin, do you want to come in there? Sorry.
Yeah, unfortunately, particularly the regulatory regime is complex and fast moving, particularly on circularity from the Commission if you're having to deal with Europe. So one has to accept that and then put in a radar to monitor that. But of course, some of this is more longer term. So I think it's sitting down and trying to work through, and it comes back to getting somebody on this, not just on net zero, but on circularity, to identify immediate short-term, medium-term, and longer-term actions. So the first action is to just set something up to monitor it. But you don't have to take action immediately on a lot of this. It's just evolving, but it's just knowing that this is coming and starting to prepare for a new future.
Yeah, and I think if I can sort of, we're members, so we can be confidential. I think there's something there that we can do at BSI as well, having to have implement standards in regulated industries, particularly in industry, and downloading a standard. It isn't easy, and I think particularly Flex 3030 has some case studies and that kind of thing. And I think from a standards maker's point of view, that is incredibly useful when we know how to do that and we get examples on how that's been translated into business practice. It's very useful for businesses to have. Considering I've been given a sort of 5-minute warning, I think we'll have to close it down there. So what I'd suggest is that we take some of those questions and look at them offline and hopefully answer some of those and possibly have a follow-up if that was quite useful. I hope that was useful and insightful. For me, it definitely was. I've learned a lot, so that was very, very useful for me. So I want to sort of close by thanking you, the speakers, for a great session today. That was really good, and as I say, I've learned a lot. I hope our audience learned a lot as well. I think you have really outlined the challenges, but also more so the opportunities, both for net zero and circularity. I also want to thank you, the audience, for a great session and for your participation. We'll look at some of those questions, and if you're interested in having a follow-up, please do let us know. We will follow up with all audience member with an email containing a recording of today's session and the other sessions, and a link to any sort of relevant information. So I'll conclude it there. Thank you all for your support today. That was a very good session. Thank you.